My name is Donald. I am a widower. I'm 74 years old, and I lived alone for a long time in the same house in Aurora, Colorado, a house that I built myself, with the calloused hands of someone who was never lazy to love with effort. It was there that I raised my daughter, Melissa. It was there that I saw my wife, Jane, take her last breath, and it was there, too, that I realized that someone I loved was treating me like a burden. Have you ever felt like you've become a nuisance to your own family? Have you noticed that little by little visits have become favors, and affection has become an obligation? Well, that's how I found out that my daughter, the one I cradled in my arms and paid for college with the sweat of my brow, was seeing me as an obstacle, a nuisance. If you've ever wondered how someone so close to you can become so cold, this video is for you. Because here I'm going to tell you what I heard, what I felt, and what I did after that. This is a story about betrayal without screaming, and about the silent response of an old father who got tired of being discarded, and that's when everything began to change. But before we dive into the heart of the story, I need you to know something. Not all pain comes with screaming. Sometimes it arrives like a whisper, pierces the chest, and lodges in silence. I was home alone when I answered the phone, and after hearing what I heard, something in me broke for good. My daughter didn't hang up the call properly, and that's when I heard, with all the letters, "He's a burden. I think it's about time." That was not said with sadness nor with concern. It was calm, with calculation, like someone talking about an old piece of furniture that disturbs the decoration of the room. And at that very moment I made a decision, one that no one expected. Neither did she. Neither did her husband. Not even those who think that old is only good for giving work. If you've made it this far, if this story has already squeezed something inside your chest, then I ask you, stay with me. Give me this vote of listening. Press the like button, subscribe. It's not by number. It's for me to feel that I'm not telling this alone, that there are still people who see value in those who were grounded. Because what's next? It is still hard for me to remember. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those when the sun is already beginning to set behind the mountains of Denver, and the light enters through the living room window in a golden way. I was with the kettle on the fire, making my chamomile tea, when the phone rang. I recognized the number right away. Melissa. I'm always happy when she calls, even if it's rare. I answered, trying to disguise my joy, and she came with that hurried tone of someone who is solving 10 things at the same time. "Hi, Dad, how are you?" He asked if I had taken my medicines, if I was eating right, if I needed something from the pharmacy. I replied yes, that everything was fine, even though I ate the same soup as yesterday, heated in the microwave. I don't like to worry anyone. I never liked it. She commented on the marketing conference in Phoenix, saying that she and Brad were exhausted, but excited about the contacts they were making. I listened to everything carefully, as always. Her voice was still my little girl's, but with an ice that has grown over the years. "Love you, Dad," she said before hanging up. And I, with that old custom of waiting for the other to end the call, took the phone slowly to the hook. But before I could put it in its place, I heard her voice again. The call was still open, and that's when the world stopped. "I think it's time to sort out Dad's situation," she said. Her voice was different now. It wasn't a daughter's. She was a problem manager. "He can no longer live alone, it's dangerous." On the other side, Brad replied with the calm of someone who makes a statement. "The house is worth at least $900,000 in Aurora. We could solve this and still have entrance to Boulder." I stood still, with the phone against his chest. The noise of boiling tea behind me seemed distant, as if the water was evaporating inside me too. They weren't worried about my health. It wasn't that. He was not careful. It was strategy. I was a spreadsheet. I who hit every nail in that house. I who put the door to her room with my bare hands. Me, who overtimed for years to pay for her studies in Fort Collins. Now I was Daddy's situation. I took a deep breath. I calmly hung up the phone. I stared at nothing for a while. On the shelf, the photo of Jane smiling in the garden. It was an old portrait, from the summer of '92. I wanted to talk to her, but all that came out was silence. Funny how a single sentence changes everything. The years were not apart, nor the rushed visits on Father's Day. It was that phrase. Cold. Surgical. The house is worth at least $900,000. She thought the house was hers, that everything was hers, as if I had already ceased to exist. No, there is a kind of pain that does not cause scandal. She just sinks, silent, slowly, and you disappear a little inside without anyone noticing. If you've ever felt this, of being left aside by those you helped the most, tell me here in the comments. He writes, I've lived it. Or, I believe. Sometimes just seeing that we are not alone, it relieves us a little. That night, I sat on the couch without turning on the lights. I stood there listening to the noise of the wall clock, aik-ti-tack, aik-ti-tack, the same watch I bought with Jane on our 20th wedding anniversary. Everything that was mine suddenly became theirs in the mouth of that call. But it was also there that something began to change in me. I was not a frail old man. I had only forgotten what I was capable of. And at that moment, I started to remember. And that's when an idea emerged, as clear as the silence of that room. Were they prepared to deal with an old man who still knew how to build? Because if I built all that once, he also knew how to dismount. That's it. It was just the beginning. After I hung up the phone, I stood there for long minutes, not knowing if what I had heard was really real, or if my head was playing a trick. But the silence around me confirmed every word. I walked slowly down the corridor, like someone crossing an old bridge over an abyss. And then I listened, the sound of the pendulum clock ticking. Act, tack, act, tack. That sound had never seemed so loud to me. It was the gift Jane gave me on our 30th wedding anniversary. She said that time was our most precious asset, and that watch was just a reminder for us not to waste the seconds together. Now, each beat seemed to mock the time I gave to those who didn't know how to keep it. I passed through the living room and went to the kitchen. I put my hands on the wooden countertop, which I made myself with boards repurposed from a shed I helped demolish in the 80s. I remember to this day, I came home all dirty with cement, but with a smile on my face. Jane called me crazy, and I replied, crazy is the one who pays dearly for things we can do with love. Every inch of that house had my mark on it. The oak floor of the living room was laid by me, clapboard by clapboard, with nail, hammer, and knee aching. The pantry shelves, the cupboards, even the front porch. Everything was made with my own hands. And now, that was a liquidity asset. I went up the stairs without haste. At each step, a memory. Melissa, still small, slipping in her pajamas and laughing. Jane sitting at the top, combing her hair. I arrived in the upstairs room, the room where my wife spent her last days. I opened the door slowly. The smell of it was still there, even after so many years. The duvet folded, the rocking chair near the window, the little table with the letters she wrote and never sent. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, where a picture with the word gratitude still hung on it by hand. Gratitude, beautiful word, but today it seemed bitter to me. I didn't cry. My whole body wanted it, but I held on. I just stood there, quiet, thinking about the way everything changes without us noticing. A call, a sentence, an oversight, and we begin to see what has always been there but that the heart refused to accept. It was there, in that room, that I began to see the house in a different way. Before it was shelter, memory, promise. Now, it was territory, and I was being pushed out of it, as if my presence was an obstacle. Melissa didn't want to take care of me. She wanted to relocate me, erase myself slowly, as if it were possible to transfer someone's story with the signing of a contract. I got up slowly. I walked to the window and looked outside. The street lights were already on. The neighbor next door was cleaning the sidewalk. The world went on. But inside me, something had stopped. It's strange how we get used to being ignored. First are the invitations that no longer arrive, then the hugs that become formal, the calls that become protocol, and when you realize, you have become a decoration item of the memory of others, something that only serves to cause nostalgia after it is gone. But I was still there, alive and conscious. I went back downstairs and sat on the couch. I ran my hand over the cushions, the seams that Jane embroidered by hand. Never throw away what has value, she would tell me. And there, sitting on that couch, I knew they were throwing me away. And it was at that moment that a question appeared firmly inside my head. What is still mine? The blood, the name, the sacrifices, all this they had already taken. But that house was still mine. And if it was mine, then I was the one who was going to decide her fate. Have you ever had this feeling that they tried to erase you slowly, smiling as if to say it's for your good? Because from that moment on, I stopped being just a rejected parent. I became a man with a plan. But to take the first step, I needed to confirm one thing, and what I found out the next day, it would change everything. That morning, still with the bitter taste of the night before in my mouth, I got up early. I didn't even drink coffee. I went straight to the office closet where I keep everything I've ever paid for. Signed, built. My memories are not only on the walls of the house, they are in the papers, in the dates, in the numbers. I opened the back drawer, the one that only I knew how to unlock. I sat on the chair creaking and started pulling folder by folder. The dust was rising, but my head was clear. I wanted to remind you, not what they said, but of what I did for them. There it was, Melissa's college contract. 4 years paid with my sweat, overtime on top of overtime. I remember it well. I took 2 shifts in the winter of 2002 just to cover her tuition in Fort Collins. He worked with a leaky glove, with his knee hurting, but smiling inside. It was for her. It always has been. At that time, she said that I was her hero. I kept flipping through. I found the blue wedding briefcase. It even had a golden ribbon. Inside, the receipts from the buffet, the photographer, the flowers. It was all expensive, but she cried so much saying that she wanted a princess day that I couldn't say no. We split the buffet into 24 installments. Jane was worried about the bills, but I said, "It's just money. Daughter, we only marry once." Further on, I found a folded paper with staples still attached. It was the note for Brad's car repair. Broken transmission, $4,200. I remember it like today. He arrived here with a poor face saying he needed the car so he wouldn't lose his job. I paid on the same day. Do you know what he said? Nothing. Not even a, "Thank you, father-in-law." He just took the keys and left. I stared at that stack of receipts on the table, one by one, like bricks from an invisible house that I was building for them. But now, they were treating me like rubble, an old man who no longer knows how to live alone. A risk, a situation that needed to be resolved. It didn't make me angry. It gave me certainty. Do you know what hurt me the most there? It wasn't the money. It never was. It was silence, the lack of recognition, the way all this was forgotten, like I'm just the old man sitting on the couch. They no longer saw the man who built it all. They only saw the discomfort that took up space. I ran my hands over the papers, slowly, as if saying goodbye to a part of himself. There was my story as a father, not perfect but whole. I was not a saint, but I was present, and I was generous beyond measure. And it was at this point that a thought began to take shape within me, first as a whisper, then as a certainty. Maybe they have forgotten who I am, but I haven't forgotten. And if they think they can decide my fate for me, maybe it's time to remind them who they're dealing with. But for that, I needed proof, a simple confirmation. The house was still in my name. What if it was? Then I would have what I needed to take the next step. And what I found out in the lawyer's office, it was more than a relief. It was a key that would open a door they never imagined. The next morning I opened the wardrobe and stared at the old gray suit, the same one I wore to Jane's funeral. He still had the folded handkerchief in his pocket. With a faint smell of her perfume mixed with time, I dressed slowly, as if honoring an unspoken promise. I took from the drawer the card that she herself made me keep years ago, insisting, "You never know what tomorrow will bring, Don. Better to have a good lawyer for these things." At the time, I laughed. I said I wouldn't need it. But now, that little piece of paper gained another weight. I drove to Colfax Avenue with my hands firmly on the wheel. Todd's office was in a discreet building, not flashy. I sat at the reception and waited. When he appeared, he recognized me right away. Donald Madsen? Of course I remember. His wife was a cautious woman. I nodded, and I entered the room. I didn't say much. I handed over the folder with the deed to the house, the original document that Jane and I signed when we were still young and dreamers. Todd analyzed it calmly. He read every line, every clause, and then he looked up with a slight smile, almost surprised. "Mr. Madsen, this house is 100% in your name. No co-ownership, no active power of attorney, no contestation. You can sell it tomorrow if you want." Hearing that was like breathing again. I didn't smile. I only closed my eyes for a moment. He had a certainty in his hands that no one else could deny. I was not hostage to anyone, neither emotionally nor legally. He asked me if I needed help starting a process. I replied that I haven't yet, that he just wanted to know how things were. I thanked him, squeezed his hand tightly, and left. In the car, I sat with the steering wheel in my hands for a few minutes before turning on. Outside, people were hurrying around, the noise of the street mixed with the sound of the brakes of a bus that stopped. But inside me, everything was silent. And for the first time in days, calm. I returned home in the late afternoon. The sky was beginning to change color, that shade between gold and rust that always reminded me of Jane reading in the window. It was a window that I built for her, protruding to get more light. She said that the right light made books seem more alive. I stared for a few minutes. That was her favorite corner, and now it was mine. But something inside me said that the time of that window was running out. You're there listening to me, following all this. I'm here opening my heart, telling a story that cost me dearly to live. If this touched you in any way, if you feel that it is worth continuing, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Not for me, but because I still have a lot to tell you. That night, I slept with the documents next to the bed, not out of mistrust, but out of respect for the truth they carried. And as I lay there looking at the ceiling, I knew. Now, it was my turn to decide. But before acting, I needed to put together a plan. A plan that didn't scream, that didn't threaten, but that left a mark. And that's when I met Brian, the broker who didn't ask questions, but knew how to read the silence of an old wounded father. The next morning, after a lukewarm and unhurried coffee, I sat in front of the old computer that was still in Melissa's room. It was one of those desktops she left behind when she moved in with Brad. I never paid much attention to this internet business. Jane said that I looked like a man from another century, so afraid to press buttons. But that day, something pushed me in front of the screen. I needed information, and fast. I opened the browser calmly and wrote, with the stiff fingers of someone who barely knew how to type, "Broker houses for sale, fast, Denver, Colorado." Google showed me a huge list, but one name caught my attention, Brian Carter. The photo showed a young man in a blue suit and an honest smile. In the profile, he said that he was a specialist in discreet sales focusing on senior customers. Clicked. I read everything carefully, and I wrote down the number. I called at the end of the morning. He answered a nice girl, asked if I was Mr. Madsen, and if he could pass on the call. Brian answered a few seconds later. His voice was calm, respectful. I explained that I was a widower, lived in Aurora, and needed to understand better about direct sales to cash buyers. He listened to me attentively, without interrupting. In the end, he said he could go there the next afternoon without commitment, just to get to know the property. Accepted. The next day, I opened the house early. I vacuumed the carpet in the living room, cleaned the dust from the hallway frame, left a lemon cake on the table, a habit Jane had whenever someone came. When his car stopped at the entrance, I felt a tightness in my chest. It was as if I was delivering something. Not yet, but soon. Brian was younger than I expected. 30-something, well-groomed beard, attentive eyes. When he entered, he stood in the doorway for a few seconds, looking around. "Mr. Madsen, with all due respect, I have never seen a property so well cared for by an old man. It looks like the house was built last week." I gave a suppressed smile. It was built with love. Love lasts. He walked through the rooms, took notes, took discreet photos, and he explained, "With the type of maintenance you did here and considering the neighborhood, the house can be sold quickly, especially for cash buyers. Hopefully, in less than 10 days. I listened to everything quietly. I only asked a few specific questions. About fees, about deadlines, about the type of contract. I didn't tell my reasons. He didn't need to. Brian seemed to understand that there was something there besides brick and roof. When we finished, he held out his hand to me. "If you want to move forward, I can prepare the options today." Thanked. He said he would contact him the next day. When he left, I stood in the doorway watching the car drive away. The house was silent, but now it was a different silence. A farewell silence. I walked slowly through the kitchen, ran my fingers over the cabinet doors. I went upstairs, sat down in Jane's rocking chair, and stared at the window. On the wall of the room, the calendar still marked the previous month. Melissa had left it like this the last time she passed by for 5 minutes. "I'll fix it later, Dad." He didn't. And now, I wouldn't fix it anymore either. I knew she and Brad were back from Phoenix in 7 days. They had warned by message as if informing the arrival of a package. And inside I was already counting the hours, not out of anxiety, but for precision. The plan was in place, but there was still an important piece missing. A decision that was going to change the fate of every wall in that house. And this decision, I would drink it that same night. Brian returned 2 days later, this time with a tablet in hand, a folder of documents, and an even more professional look. I already knew that it came with numbers, but I didn't imagine that they were so high. We sat at the living room table, that same table where, years ago, I taught Melissa how to do head math with bottle caps. Brian opened the tablet, showed me the photos he had taken, the market data, comparisons with neighboring houses. Mr. Madsen, with the impeccable condition of this house and the location in Aurora, the estimated value is between $800,000 and $810,000. And actually, I already have a buyer in sight, a Denver investor who buys without financing. You would have the money in the account in 8 days. I was silent for a few seconds. I looked around. The room still had the scratches on the floor from when Melissa knocked over the coffee table playing Castle. In the corner of the bookcase, there was still the stain of the coffee that Jane spilled laughing at a silly joke I told one winter night. Everything there was history, and everything there, in a way, was also an end. I took a deep breath, and with a firm hand, as if signing a new chapter, he said, "Let's go ahead." Brian smiled slightly. Not of those who celebrate, but of those who understand. He pulled out the papers. He explained each clause patiently. It guaranteed confidentiality, speed, and legal certainty. I read it all twice, and I signed it. Not angry, not in a hurry. I signed with the serenity of someone who, for the first time in a long time, was doing something for himself. As he arranged the papers, he asked me, "Are you sure your family is aware of this sale?" I looked out the window, where the light was shining exactly on the lavender bed Jane planted in the summer of '96, and replied calmly, "They'll know when it's time." That afternoon, as Brian walked away with the documents under his arm, I realized that something had changed inside me. I was no longer the father waiting for a phone call. I was the man who built this house with sweat. And now, with the same silence, I was deconstructing it, brick by brick. You know, there are people who think that the elderly only lose the strength, the memory, the voice. But the truth is that sometimes we just stay quiet to observe better. And if you've made it this far, I'll tell you, there's still something big to happen. What's coming? It is the point at which everything will turn. That night I sat alone on the porch with a cup of tea in my hands. The wind blew lightly and the smell of lavender rose from the garden. I found myself remembering the little Melissa, running with the purple dress, her knees scraped and the smile without guilt. My heart almost faltered, but it was only for a moment, because at that moment I was no longer a broken man. I was someone with a plan in motion, and the next step, it would be to disappear before they returned. Because if the house was mine, so would the silence. But how to hide an entire sale without leaving a trace? That's where the detail that changed everything comes in, and that to this day, no one in my family could understand. There were 3 days left before the sale closed. 3 days for that house to officially stop being mine, or rather, of being seen by others as the place where I should end my days. It was on a Friday afternoon that I called the locksmith, a boy named Kyle, polite, soft-spoken. I explained that I wanted to change all the locks, on the front door, the back door, and the side driveway. He didn't even ask why. It just did the job accurately. I followed in silence, watching each screw coming out, each old lock being removed. It was like pulling out roots. The garage was the most symbolic detail. The old controller, programmed with Melissa and Brad's access, has been reset. I knew they used the garage as a driveway whenever they showed up unannounced. It was comfortable for them. But now there was no more comfort to be offered. After Kyle left, I sat down at the table with pen and paper. I wrote with firm handwriting, without anger, without haste, only the truth. The letter read, "Melissa, Brad, you planned my departure. I just advanced. This house, which I built with my hands and heart, was also built with confidence. When it was over, the house ended for you too. I am fine. I don't need to be sought." I signed with my full name, not father, not with love, only Donald Madsen. No. There comes a time in life when silence is stronger than any argument. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to leave in one piece. If you've ever felt this, that shutting up and leaving hurts less than trying to explain yourself, let me know in the comments. Write something like, "I understand you," or "I know how it is." We are not the only one. And sometimes, just knowing that someone is listening, it already makes a difference. Then I went upstairs to the bedroom, opened the old closet, and picked up the leather suitcase Jane gave me when I turned 60. It's for when you decide to go out traveling, Dawn. I never used it, but now she would finally have a destination. I put only the essentials inside. Some shirts, documents, my toothbrush, the photo frame with Jane's photo in the garden, and the book she liked the most, the one with the red cover with the worn pages. I closed the suitcase calmly, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling. The afternoon light cast shadows on the ceiling of a place that was no longer mine, because sometimes a house ceases to be home long before someone changes. The next morning I got in the car and drove 30 minutes to Centennial, a quiet little town with clean streets and silence in the corners. I rented a small ground-floor apartment in a group of independent elderly people. Nothing luxurious, but everything was very calm, and most importantly, it was mine. No unexpected visits, no judgments, without looks of pity. I settled my things calmly. I put Jane's picture on the kitchen shelf, and that night I lay in the new bed listening to a different kind of silence, a silence that did not weigh him. On the contrary, it was a relief, but I hadn't told you anything yet, neither for neighbors nor for friends, not even for Pastor Eli, from the community, because what I had prepared, it had to happen without warning. And when Melissa came back from Phoenix and found the house closed, the codes changed, and a sign in the garden, what would she do? This answer. It came faster than I imagined. On Friday afternoon, the sun was still high when I received the notification on my cell phone. The camera at the main entrance, the one I installed months ago just to be sure, started transmitting in real time. I sat in the armchair of my new apartment with chamomile tea in my hands and my heart in silence. Brad's black car parked right where I knew he would stop. Melissa left first, in high heels, with a small suitcase and her cell phone glued to her ear. Brad came right behind, wearing that blue dress shirt he always wore when he wanted to look serious. They came straight from the airport, probably ready to take control of the house they already treated as their own. Melissa climbed the 3 steps of the balcony in a hurry and tried to turn the key. Nothing. He tried again, harder. Nothing. He made that impatient face that I've known since adolescence. Brad tried too, bent down, looked at the lock, mumbled something that the camera didn't quite catch. Then she tried to control the garage. She squeezed, shook, pointed from all angles. The door remained motionless. That's when they saw the white envelope taped to the door. She ripped the paper off hard, opened it right there. I could see the exact moment her eyes froze. I read his lips whispering my name, and soon after, the scream. A dry cry from someone who does not understand what is happening. He sold. He sold. Brad took the paper from her hands, read it with a furrowed brow, trying to keep his composure. But even he, the man of spreadsheets and cold calculations, had to sit on the step to absorb. There it was. My letter. Melissa, Brad. You planned my departure. I just advanced. This house was mine from start to finish. It was built with love, and now it has been sold with freedom. I wish you to find your way without depending on what is mine. Donald Madsen. Melissa paced back and forth calling someone. Maybe me, maybe her lawyer, maybe her own echo. Brad was still trying to stay calm, but you could see that he understood. They were out of the game. There was no scandal. There was no door slamming. Just 2 adults confronting the mirror of their own greed. And I, on the other side of the screen, don't smile. I didn't celebrate. I didn't vibrate. But I felt justice. A justice that does not scream, that he does not accuse, that simply returns. Seeing that was not pleasurable. It was necessary. I ran my hand slowly on the arm of the armchair. I looked around my new home. Small, yes, but whole. And for the first time in years, mine. Funny how we only realized we were stuck when we finally breathed fresh air. On the screen, Melissa was crying now, sitting on the front stairs with her head in her hands. Maybe because of the shock, maybe because of shame. Brad walked down the sidewalk, talking loudly on the phone, gesticulating. But there was nothing more to negotiate. That house was history, and they were just visitors who arrived too late. But do you know what surprised me the most? It was not their reaction. That's what happened 3 days later, when Melissa came to me, and it wasn't to apologize. It was to demand something that she thought she was still entitled to. On Monday afternoon, the weather was cloudy, that kind of sky that doesn't know if it's going to rain or open, but that seems to match certain silences of the soul. I was already in my apartment, sitting on the balcony with a lukewarm coffee, when the camera warning came up again. Someone entered. Melissa, not through the door, through the side window of the laundry room, the one I left unlocked on purpose, not by carelessness, but by intuition. She pushed the window tactfully, as if she had done that before. She jumped hard and landed on her feet on the carpet, looking around with the eyes of a huntress, as if she still believed that, with a little insistence, everything would be hers again. Minutes later, Brad appeared along the same path. She unlocked the door for him and the two entered together, dragging suitcases as if returning from vacation. But there was no one else to receive. The house was clean, smelling, and completely empty of presents. It had furniture, yes. There was a curtain, there was a painting, but it had no life. He had no father. In the middle of the room, on the beige carpet, was the second letter. Brad saw it first. He took it and read it in silence. He gave it to Melissa. She also read more than once, her eyes wide, her mouth half open. In the letter, I wrote something simple. Melissa, I left this window open because I knew you would come. Not afraid, but sure. That house now belongs to someone else. Everything here was delivered with dignity and justice. You have not lost a home. You lost the right to think that I was invisible. I wish you to find a home. But this one, it's no longer yours. She didn't cry at the time. He didn't scream. He only looked around with a mixture of despair and confusion. He walked around the house as if he expected to find me behind a door, on the couch, in the kitchen, chopping apples as before. Brad tried to keep his composure. He picked up the phone, started looking for lawyers specializing in contesting real estate sales. I saw his reflection in the living room mirror, as he said, there has to be some gap. He is elderly. There must be something that makes it illegal. But there wasn't. And the worst thing for them was not the house, it was the fact that they were left out. I stood there watching on the screen, seeing my daughter walk through the room where she took her first steps, now trying to take steps back in history. But time does not come back, and not everything can be undone with an apology. You know, if this piece of my life can become a mirror or a hug for someone, help me carry it forward. Like and subscribe here to the channel. This makes more difference than you think. There is a story that, when it is shared, becomes strength for those who listen. Melissa sat on the floor of the living room and for the first time was silent. There was nothing more to say. And there, in the middle of the house that she already considered hers, she felt what I felt for years. The impotence to love those who no longer see you as someone whole. But the most unexpected was yet to come. Because 3 days later, she didn't come back with flowers. Not even with tears. She returned with a lawyer. And with a threat. On Wednesday morning, the silence was again interrupted by the camera. Melissa and Brad were there again, but this time they didn't bring bags. They arrived empty-handed and faces heavy. The way they walked said it all. They were no longer a couple in sync. It was as if each one was carrying their own weight, and the others as well. The door camera caught the exact moment Melissa turned to Brad and said in a dry voice, "You said everything was under control." He did not immediately respond. He only looked around as if looking for an invisible ally. Then he sighed deeply and let go. "Did you really think he wouldn't notice? You treated your father as if he were an old chess piece, and now you want me to fix it?" Melissa stared at him as if she had been slapped. "You kept repeating that this house was the only way to save us. You made me believe that I just had to wait for him. Weaken. You threw that weight on me." The conversation, which I heard in fragments through the camera with limited audio, took on an increasingly harsh tone. "I warned you that my work was unstable, but you never asked the details, did you?" Brad threw the truth there, with the venom of someone who no longer minces words. "I was fired 3 months ago, Melissa, and it wasn't just because of a team cut. I'm being investigated." She froze. Even from afar, even through the camera, I could see the shock on her face. Investigated for what? Investment manipulation, an anonymous complaint. I needed this house to prove solvency, to show that I still have some personal assets. That was our salvation. Melissa sat on the porch step, the same one where she had seen me so many times drinking coffee. He looked at the ground for a few seconds. Then, in a choked voice, he said, "You threw everything on my back. It made me become my own father's villain. And on top of that, you lied to me all this time?" Brad, with his shoulders slumped, did not answer. "You know, there are times when the castle collapses not because of an earthquake, but because of the cracks that we pretended not to see. If you've been following this far, know that the strongest is yet to come. Because it wasn't just the house that fell. It was the whole illusion that collapsed. And when the truth comes out like this, naked and raw, no one comes out clean." Melissa stood up angrily, pushed Brad on the shoulder. He tried to hold her arm, but she let go. He shouted something that the camera didn't catch, but that I understood just by looking. It was the end of both. The couple who seemed so decisive, so united in ambition, now it was just a pair of losers pointing fingers at each other in the midst of the ruins they themselves caused. She left first with quick, nervous steps. Brad stayed for a few more minutes, sitting there motionless. And then, With the same fatigue of someone who lost a war, he got up and left. But what neither of them knew, it was that, while they were sinking into their own guilt, I was preparing the last gesture, something that didn't involve revenge, but memory, something that would show, once and for all, who I was and who I continued to be. I sat in my armchair in Centennial, looking out the window at the late afternoon that dyed the sky orange and gray, and turned on the camera on my cell phone. There they were, Melissa and Brad, in what I still mentally called the living room of my house, walking from one side to the other, arguing, losing more and more emotional balance. I could hear the murmurs and screams drowned out by the audio system, but unlike before, I didn't feel like intruding. I didn't feel pleasure in seeing their fall. I just watched, silently, as if I were a witness who didn't need to take sides. As time passed, I realized how heavy it was for them to feel the helplessness I had felt so many years. That weight was not measured in words nor in looks. It was the chill of realizing that after so many attempts to manipulate and control, everything had slipped out of his hands. And me? I only breathed slowly with the calm of someone who understood that justice does not need shouts or confrontations to be accomplished. At one point, I turned off the camera. I didn't want to watch the complete degradation. That momentary satisfaction of seeing the other suffer did not concern me. Jane said to me years ago as we looked at the flames of the fireplace, "Don, you don't fight mud with more mud. Push it away and let it dry." At that moment, I understood what she meant. It wasn't about revenge, it was about freedom. To free myself from the burden they thought they had on me. I sat in silence, and my mind began to wander through the memories of the house that no longer existed. I remembered Sunday mornings, when Jane would make pancakes and I would set the table, Melissa's first step on the living room carpet, the laughter that echoed down the hallway, of the little fights about which movie to watch on Friday night. Memories that, even without their presence, still belonged to me. Sometimes I think about how powerful some memories are, capable of marking us forever, of bringing tears and smiles at the same time. And you who are listening to me, have you ever stopped to think about a memory that never goes away? Look in your own chest of memories, and if you want, share in the comments something special, something that marked you just as these little things marked my life. Later, I sat on the balcony of the apartment and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Dry, deep, non-celebratory relief. It was a kind of freedom that I didn't even know existed for me yet. I no longer needed to prove anything. I no longer needed to argue or justify my actions. The house was gone, but my peace came in another way. That night, I fell asleep early. For the first time in a long time, I slept soundly, with light shoulders and my heart calm. No resentment, no anger, no expectation of return or gratitude. Justice had happened by itself, and I was now a man free from the emotional burden they tried to impose on me. But as I slept, an idea began to form, clear and silent. One last piece that would complete the picture, because there was still something to do, something that did not involve anger nor revenge, but that would ensure that the lesson Melissa and Brad needed to learn would be recorded forever. And the question that came to me already waking up in the early morning was clear. How would I show them that freedom and respect are not things that are asked for, but what are conquered? The morning sun poured in softly through the windows of my small apartment in Centennial, illuminating every corner in a way that made me feel that this space, though modest, was finally mine. The first thing I did was put my old kettle on the electric stove and brew a strong coffee, the way Jane had always liked. As the aroma spread through the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, the feeling that everything could start again, without haste, without demands, without looks that judged me for being too old or heavy. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood and soon discovered a small coffee shop called The Rusty Mug, a place that had simple charm and kind people behind the counter. The barista, a young man named Ethan, greeted me with a warm smile, calling me Mr. Donald, something that made me feel respect and consideration in a way I hadn't in a long time. I started going there every day, drinking my coffee and watching people move around, feeling part of the world again without needing anyone's approval. It didn't take long to discover the city's senior community center. There I found a group that met every afternoon to play chess and talk. I was never a great player, but I liked the concentration, the strategy, the silence that stretched between one play and another. Gradually, I realized that each move on the board reflected, in a way, life's choices. I learned to appreciate that simple routine. Every morning, every afternoon, Every trivial conversation that reminded me that life still had room for small victories and moments of joy. In the apartment, I started to organize my belongings differently. I bought a new notebook and started writing memoirs. Jane's, Melissa's as a child, the house we built together in Aurora. Each page bore memories that were not just facts, but fragments of life that shaped who I was. Writing has become a silent therapy. There was no anger in the words. There was no desire for revenge, just the narrative of the life I lived and the love I still kept. I also learned to walk around the neighborhood without looking back. He didn't think about inheritance anymore. He didn't think about Melissa like before. Now she was just a memory in my story, not a shadow over my future. Every gesture of self-care, every plant I watered in my small garden, every conversation with neighbors about gardening or the weather made me feel part of the world again. The neighbors, who had previously seen me as the silent lord of the building, now greeted me with cordiality. He said that he was retired from construction and laughed when he heard comments about the growth of flowers or the price of tomatoes in the market. There was no mention of the house I sold. There was no mention of the recent drama. That part of life remained guarded, as if it were a closed chapter that did not need to be reopened. Sometimes, when walking through the streets, I found myself smiling alone, remembering little stories of Jane and Melissa, but with a different feeling. There was no sadness or anger, only acceptance. I had built my life, faced betrayals and injustices, and yet I was here, whole, capable of creating new moments, new memories, new routines that no one could take away from me. On one of those afternoons at the coffee shop while I was drinking my coffee and watching the young people talking around me, I realized how important emotional freedom was. It wasn't about the house, it wasn't about the inheritance, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about feeling that each day was mine, that my choices still had value, that life could still be lived fully, even with decades on my back. It was in this daily silence that I understood something profound. True justice was not in confrontation. It was not in shouting or retaliation. It was about continuing to live with dignity, about regaining control over my own history and my own happiness. Every cup of coffee, every chess move, every sentence written in my notebook reminded me of that. And so, my life went on without fanfare. Small rituals, small joys, small silent victories. A walk through the park, a conversation with the market manager, a rainy afternoon watching the wind play with the trees. The freedom was in the details, in the choice of how to live, in the autonomy that no one could take away from me. But even in this quiet routine, there was a sensation in the air, something that reminded me that, although the pain had passed, the lessons were still being assimilated, and that somewhere, the story I was living now began to be reflected in those who, weeks ago, tried to diminish me. And as I closed the notebook once again, keeping the memories of Jane and what I built in Aurora, I knew that life still had something more in store, because emotional freedom isn't just about escaping injustices. It's also about preparing your heart for the surprise that's yet to come. And the question that hovered in my mind was clear. What would the day be like when Melissa and Brad would finally fully understand what it means to lose control over what they should never have taken for granted? The next morning, I put on my most comfortable gray suit, the one Jane loved to see me wear to wedding anniversaries, and drove to Todd Reynolds' office on Colfax Avenue. The sun still reflected on the city's low-rise buildings, and I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in a long time. I knew that this meeting would not be about emotion, but about shielding, the ultimate protection I needed to live without looking back. Todd greeted me with the same calm smile as always, without haste, without judgment. We put the paperwork on the table and started reviewing each item. Accounts, assets, property, investments. Every detail had to be right, clear, unalterable. I didn't want any surprises. I didn't want anyone to be able to challenge my decisions, not even carelessly. We discussed the will first. Todd suggested some charities and technical schools that could receive donations. I accepted and asked for a scholarship to be created in Jane's name, aimed at young people who wanted to pursue a career in engineering, as well as my legacy and my passion. She helped build lives and dreams with me. May I now help others to build too, I explained in a firm voice, with no emotion leaking, but with a heart tight with remembrance. Todd then brought up the issue of Melissa. She asked gently if I wished to leave her any part of the goods. I took a deep breath and said serenely, I've already left. Time, love, sacrifice. She didn't know how to keep it. I don't need to add anything else. He nodded, understanding that it wasn't about anger or resentment but about certainty, of protection. Next, we moved on to the practical part, opening a trust account, structured in such a way that any heir could not contest or access the funds without specific approval. Todd explained in detail, like a conductor, each clause and each safety protocol. I listened attentively, mentally writing down every detail, feeling the weight of independence that account represented. It was the realization of years of effort, sweat, and learning. It was not revenge. It was not punishment. It was freedom. As Todd typed out the final contracts, I felt myself observing a rebirth of sorts. Each decision made in that office reminded me that I no longer had to worry about manipulations, blackmail, expectations from those who did not know how to respect my effort and dedication. The life I built alongside Jane was safe. The legacy he would leave to society would be lasting, and I could finally look to the future without fear that the same mistakes would be repeated. I signed each document with firm hands, feeling the strength of someone who has achieved something that is not measured in money. It was the peace that I always sought, that tranquility that comes when justice is carried out without noise, without violence, only through the clarity of choices and the integrity of acts. Todd closed the briefcase, smiled, and said, "Now you're all set, Donald. You left nothing to chance." I smiled slightly, feeling an unusual lightness. A cycle had ended. I didn't need to scream, I didn't need to confront. He didn't need Melissa's gratitude. My life was armored, my possessions were protected, and respect for myself was intact. As I drove back to my apartment, I thought about how life is made of choices. Some are silent, discreet, but carry more weight than any impetuous gesture. And that was my choice, to protect my present, my future, my legacy. No drama, no confrontations, just wisdom and patience. When I got home, I put the documents in the safe place and sat in the armchair by the window, watching the afternoon light reflect on the trees. For the first time in a long time, I felt that nothing and no one could drag me into the past. Everything was exactly where it should be. I was in control, free from any manipulation, with a calm heart and a clear mind. And as the sun set on the horizon, a thought crossed my mind. Melissa and Brad thought they could control me, that they could take what didn't belong to them. But now, even if they tried again, even if the past knocked on the door, I was no longer vulnerable. My freedom was no longer in the walls of a house or in the hands of others. It was inside me, and it was in that moment of silent peace, watching the city light up with small and dim lights, that I realized something even more powerful. True freedom is not conquered with anger, nor with revenge. It is conquered with the right choices, careful planning, and the courage to let go of what you can no longer control. But even with all that sorted out, a part of me knew that the story wasn't over yet, because not all lessons are learned immediately, and some ghosts only disappear when they are given the time they need to reflect on their own mistakes. And I wondered, as I closed my eyes for a few seconds and felt the gentle breeze coming through the window, when would Melissa and Brad finally fully understand what it means to lose control over what they should never have taken for granted? Days later, my phone rang. An unknown number, but one that I already suspected. Melissa. I took a deep breath before answering, and when I heard his voice, I felt something strange in my chest. It was not fear, nor anger, nor surprise. It was just the realization that something had changed, forever. She began to speak carefully, trying to control every syllable, every emotion that escaped. Her voice was choked but without tears, as if she wanted to show strength, even though she felt guilty. "Dad, I just wanted to say that I'm worried, that it was all a misunderstanding. Nobody wanted to hurt him," she said, with that tone that always reminded me of the girl who ran through the garden in Aurora, holding my hands confidently. I listened to everything in silence. Her every word tipped against the memory of what she and Brad had planned, and I allowed myself to feel only the weight of the truth. Nothing would be the same as before. He didn't have to answer immediately. When he finished, I thanked him calmly and serenely, saying that I appreciated the call, but that I needed to take care of my own health, my own peace. She insisted, asking if we could talk in person. I smiled slightly, almost emotionlessly, and replied, "If it is to see me as a burden, it is better not to carry the weight." There was firmness in my voice, but also a lightness that only true freedom provides. Melissa was silent on the other end of the line. I could imagine the shock, the frustration, the discomfort of realizing that that attempt at rapprochement would not change me, that I would no longer be a piece of his life to manipulate or use. She hung up without answer, and I sat staring out the window of my apartment in Centennial, feeling the wind creep in slowly, bringing with it the silence of a silent victory. There are things that we live and keep, but maybe by telling, we help another heart to breathe. Enjoy this video and subscribe, and let's make this story reach those who need it. Because in that instant, I realized that what Melissa had lost was not only the opportunity to control myself, but the chance to regain something that cannot be bought with excuses, the trust of a father who has learned to protect and love himself. And as I watched the afternoon light spread across the walls of my apartment, I thought about how some changes are definitive. There is no going back. There is no reconciliation that recovers what has been broken. I could feel that this phone call had been the last attempt at manipulation, and she now understood, even if she had not yet verbalized it, that she had lost something she could never recover. I sat down holding the cup of coffee I had brewed earlier and took a deep breath. Each sip seemed to seal the certainty that freedom is not negotiable, that peace is conquered, and that the truest justice does not need shouting or confrontation. It happens in silence, in observation, in the patience of those who have learned to wait for the right moment to act. And as the sun set on the horizon, tinting the sky with golden and orange hues, I felt that my life was finally finding the right rhythm. I could walk around the neighborhood, go to the Rusty Mug, participate in chess at the community center, write my memoirs, tend to my garden, without anyone looking at me as a burden or an obstacle. My emotional freedom was complete, but in the background, one question remained, silent, almost like a whisper. What would it be like for Melissa to deal with her own guilt, with the realization that certain opportunities in life can't be bought or recovered, even when you try desperately? How would she face the absence of control over what she once thought she was entitled to? And more importantly, what would that mean for her as a person going forward? Sitting in my small apartment in Centennial, I was reading the local newspaper while drinking my morning coffee, when I began to realize that what was happening in Aurora was spreading in a silent way, almost like a breeze that carries the smell of flowers through the neighborhood. Mrs. Whitaker, who lived next door to my old house, remarked to another neighbor that I had always been a dignified gentleman, someone who cared for the house, the garden, and the family with attention and respect. She didn't know the details, she didn't need to know, but her observation carried a profound truth. There were people who recognized, however subtly, the integrity of my life. Other residents began to notice Melissa and Brad walking tensely through the streets, dejected with lost looks and heavy steps. Some murmured that something strange had happened, that they seemed to carry an invisible weight, but that it weighed heavily on the eyes of those who observed them. Brad, in his desperate attempt to save the image, tried to explain the situation, saying that I had been confused, that I had disappeared for no reason. But these explanations did not resist the small clues scattered around the neighborhood. The house was no longer in my possession, but in the hands of legal buyers. My belongings, the minimum essentials, were removed in an organized way. Everything had been done with care, precision, and dignity, just as I had always done in my life. The truth, little by little, began to emerge. People began to realize that I had not been manipulated, that I had not been deceived. I had decided quietly and firmly that I would no longer allow my life to be reduced to a burden or a tradable asset. And the effect of this spread unexpectedly. The old man who seemed frail, the quiet and gentle gentleman of the neighborhood, now became a symbol of discreet strength, a living reminder that dignity and self-control are priceless. As I brewed my second cup of coffee, I thought about how ironic life is. For years I lived for the family, for the commitments, for the hard work I built in Aurora. And now, after a sequence of silent choices, he realized that the greatest reward was not the money, it was not the house, it was not traditional revenge. It was the silent respect of those who observed and recognized the justice of my action. And suddenly, I felt a warmth in my chest, not of pride, but of silent validation. Those looks, those discreet comments, the implicit recognition of my strength and clarity, had a weight that no shout or confrontation could reach. That was true revenge, not to hurt or humiliate, but to be remembered as someone who acted with dignity, even in the face of the ingratitude of those who most expected consideration. As I watched the reflections of the sun on the streets of Aurora through the photos I received from neighbors, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and lightness. Life had given me the opportunity to step away without creating chaos, to protect my assets, my legacy, and my emotional freedom, and yet to show, in an indirect way, that no one can underestimate those who built their life with effort, love, and patience. And here's something I want you to feel with me. True strength doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't impose fear. It manifests itself in calm, firm choices that respect oneself and that leave marks that others can only observe and recognize with silence. That's the moment I realized that my life, my story, my legacy, even though I wasn't in the old house anymore, continued to reverberate, inspiring respect where there was once only contempt or indifference. And then, as the neighborhood whispered about my decision, Melissa and Brad walked the streets of Aurora, now aware that they had lost more than one home. They had lost the opportunity to control something that never belonged to them, and that learning, painful and silent, would not be forgotten. I knew that no matter how hard they tried to reinterpret the facts, no matter how hard they tried to justify themselves, the truth had already emerged. Donald was no longer a burden. He was a free man with intact choices and with respect won silently. But as I sipped my coffee and felt the gentle breeze come through the window, a question popped into my mind. How long would it take for Melissa and Brad to truly understand that the real lesson is not in words or documents or money, but in the silent weight of dignity that is not negotiable? And more importantly, would they ever be able to apply this learning in their own lives without repeating the mistakes of the past? The days started to get longer, and autumn arrived with that cold, clean air that changes the tone of the mornings. It was through an acquaintance in Aurora that I found out, without seeking to know, because the news, when it is heavy, always finds its way to those who understand it. Brad and Melissa no longer lived together. He was seen leaving the house with a suitcase without looking back, and with the expression of someone who already knew that he had lost the last piece of what he pretended to control. Some said he went to Fort Collins to be with a cousin. Others, that he was trying to start his life over in another state, perhaps in search of a job that would clear his name. I didn't need to know more than that. I understand. Time had done what I never needed to do, put everything in its place. Melissa was left alone. The same woman who had once planned my departure now lived in a small, simple, cheap-rent rented apartment, far from the lights she and Brad had so much wanted to achieve. The money that remained was little, and their friends, those who used to surround them when everything seemed promising, vanished like smoke. Life has a curious way of returning silence to those who mocked the calm of others. I heard that she tried to contact me. First, with a letter left at the community center from where I sometimes participated in chess games. The receptionist, unaware that I preferred anonymity, kept the letter and then handed it to me with a kind look. I read the sealed envelope for long minutes, feeling the weight of what it represented, but I didn't open it. I put them on the table, next to the notes in my notebook, and left them there, not out of coldness, but because I understood that there were things that no longer needed a response. Days later, the emails came. Short, formal, like someone who no longer knows what is the correct language to speak to those who have hurt. Dad, I wanted to talk. I'm sorry if I did something wrong. Can we see each other, even if it's over a coffee? The messages piled up, but my decision remained the same. Silence was my answer, because sometimes silence is not revenge. It's a limit. I followed my routine. The Rusty Mug coffee shop continued to be my refuge. People greeted me with that same affection. "Good morning, Mr. Donald," and I answered with a discreet smile. I wrote almost every day in the notebook, and each word seemed to clean the old wounds a little more. Aurora's house was a distant memory, like a photograph yellowed by time, and Jane, Jane. I could feel her nearby in every breeze that passed through the window, in every choice I now made with more serenity. Outside, the world went at its pace. The neighbors, I was told, were talking more and more about Melissa's transformation. They didn't judge her anymore, and there was a certain tone of pity, of empathy. She walked with slow steps, without makeup, with sunken eyes. They said that he had refused to sell the couple's car, even without using it, as if keeping that peace was the only way to keep what was left of his old life. And from time to time, I found myself thinking about her, not angry, not with sadness, but with that kind of compassion that only time grants. I knew she was finally learning to deal with the consequences of her own choices, that he was feeling what I felt, the loneliness, the abandonment, the weight of seeing everything he built crumble. The difference is that for me, that collapse brought peace. For her, it brought emptiness. Sometimes people need to lose what they love to understand the value of what they despised. And this is one of the quietest and most transformative pains that exist. The truth is that, even without an answer, Melissa kept trying. The letters became shorter, the messages more spaced out until one day, stopped. The silence she imposed on me so much years ago was now what I received back, not as a punishment, but as a reflex. And at that point, I realized something curious. I no longer expected anything. No excuses, no reconciliation. My heart was light. The old pain had turned into learning. I was a whole man again. But fate sometimes has a sense of irony that borders on the poetic, because just when I thought everything was resolved, that the wounds had healed for good, news reached me. Something unexpected. Something that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And at that moment I realized, my story with Melissa was not yet over. And what was to come? It was not a new betrayal. It was something that, in a strange way, would change everything again. The late afternoon in Centennial had a tone that I always liked, that calm gold, which mixes the heat of the sun with the light cold of the wind. I walked slowly through the park, that was a few blocks from my apartment, taking with me the notebook where I have written everything that was left of me and what I experienced. It is not a diary. It's another record of who I was, what I learned, and what I decided to leave in the past. I sat on my favorite bench, the one facing the lake, and watched the kids running, the couples walking hand in hand, and the dogs playing on the grass. Life went on, simple, noisy, and beautiful, even after all that I had experienced. I opened the notebook and reread some notes. There were excerpts of memories that would accompany me until the end. The smell of new wood when I built the house in Aurora. Melissa's first laugh, still a baby, when I threw her in the air and she thought she could fly. Sunday mornings with Jane, the noise of the coffee maker, and the tranquility of those who believed that love was enough to keep everything standing. I wrote about all this not to relive but to be grateful. Every memory, even the ones that hurt, is proof that I lived intensely and that I survived what they tried to take away from me. As I watched the sky change color, I thought of Jane, how much she has always been the axis of my calm. She was the one who told me, in a low voice, that true love is not blind, it is patient, that justice doesn't have to be a spectacle, it just needs to happen at the right time, in the right way. And there, sitting on that bench, I knew that everything I did was an extension of that wisdom of hers. I didn't take revenge, I protected myself. I cut the noose before the contempt killed me inside. I thought of Melissa, yes, but it didn't hurt anymore. It no longer burned as before. It was a distant memory, almost like a photograph faded by time. I could see her face, but without anger, without regret. Perhaps deep down it was just compassion. I knew she was still fighting guilt, but I also knew it was a battle only she could win. Life has taught me that you can't cure someone who doesn't want to look at themselves in the mirror. I looked at the horizon where the sun was already beginning to hide behind the mountains, and I felt a peace that I cannot describe. Everything I needed now was inside me. There were no more scores to settle, no choked words. The house, the money, the papers, all of this was just background. What was left, what really mattered, was my emotional autonomy, something that no one can take, no one can manipulate, no one can negotiate. I took the pen and wrote one more sentence in my notebook. You don't have to beat others. It is necessary to overcome what is left of the pain within us. And I closed the notebook slowly, as if ending a cycle without haste, without an audience, without regret. The children kept running, screaming, laughing. A little girl ran in front of me and reminded me of the little Melissa, with the same sparkle in her eyes and the same way of tripping over her own feet. I smiled without realizing it. Life is funny. She always finds a way to return the tenderness that time tries to steal. I stayed there until the sun disappeared for good, and when the sky turned a deep shade of blue, I looked up and whispered, in a voice that only the wind could hear, "Thank you, Jane, I kept what I promised. I promised not to let bitterness take over me. I promised not to turn love into a weapon. I promised that even alone, I would remain the man you loved, dignified, just, silent when needed." And in that instant, something inside me quieted down, the kind of silence that comes not from absence but from completeness. Justice had already been done, and life, finally, was at peace with me. But fate, capricious as it always was, still had one last card to play. A surprise that I would never have expected. And that would change the end of this story in a way that even I could not have predicted. Today, looking back, I see everything with a calm that only time is able to bring. There is no anger, no regret, just the certainty that everything happened as it needed to happen. Brad, I later learned, never returned to Aurora. I heard that he works in a small office in Fort Collins, trying to start over from scratch. And as for Melissa, she continues to live discreetly away from the spotlight and certainties she once believed she had. From time to time, someone tells me that she attends a small church, helps in social works, and that, from time to time, she mentions her father with a mixture of nostalgia and respect. Perhaps time has done to her what it did to me. It has cleansed pride, left the essential. I continue here in Centennial, walking through the same parks, drinking my coffee at the same table in the cafeteria, writing in the same notebook that I have carried with me for months. I learned that peace doesn't come when people change. It comes when we accept that not everyone will understand us. But that doesn't stop life from being beautiful, and that's what I did. Follow. Selling the house was the easy part. It was really difficult to sell the idea that I was disposable, and perhaps this was the greatest victory of my life, because sometimes the only way to be heard is silence. They wanted to shut me up in a corner, but I chose to disappear entirely, and it was the best choice I made. Starting over late takes courage, but it is also an act of self-love. I discovered that it is not age that defines us. It is the awareness of our own value. When we understand this, nothing scares us anymore. The great lesson that remained is simple but profound. There is no greater justice than respecting oneself. Life will always put people who try to measure how much we are worth, but we are the ones who decide the price of our own heart. Forgiveness sometimes isn't about talking again. It's just about stopping carrying the weight of what no longer belongs in our soul. If one day you feel forgotten, underestimated, changed, remember, while the world rushes, there is still time to rebuild your own home within yourself. And before I say goodbye, I want to really thank you for staying here with me, listening to my story. It is good to know that on the other side, there is someone who understands the value of memory, love, and dignity. If this story touched you in any way, leave your like. It's like a hug that warms you up and gives you the strength to keep sharing those memories. And if you want to come back for another coffee with me, subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about life, about starting over and everything that time teaches slowly. Write in the comments which city you are watching me. I want to know how far this conversation has come. And it activates the bell, so you don't lose it when the coffee is brewed again. Now, before I go, I invite you, don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, each wrinkle tells a story, and each story carries a strength. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story, because at the end of the day, that's what life is all about. A collection of memories, goodbyes, and beginnings. And finally, it started again.